Hi, my name is Qwek and I am a 3D character artist. Today I'll be doing a demonstration on how I created this piece entitled Monolith. And we'll go from concept to final render. I'll walk you all through my workflow. We'll touch on some sculpting techniques that I use a lot, texturing in Painter. We'll take the model over to 3D Studio Max where we set up our lighting and rendering before doing our final compositing in Photoshop. This demonstration is really meant to look at the entire process from a high level point of view. We're not going to dive into the details at all. It's more of like how do you go about creating an artwork like this and sort of giving you a holistic view of the entire process. My workflow for Monolith was a very iterative one. I would bounce between different programs often, and I feel like this video sums up my process. I usually start out in ZBrush. I would do like a quick block out, bring it into 3D Studio Max, check for my composition, make sure that I like the idea, make sure that the composition is looking good, do some temp lighting, sort of like crystallizing my vision of the final piece along the way. And the same goes for the actual texturing process. I would do my textures in Painter. I would export them into 3D Studio Max, look at them again, tweak the lighting, and then go back and forth. I do this several times throughout the process until I arrive at the final image you see here. So one question I get a lot is, where do I start, right? There are a lot of new features now in ZBrush. One of my favorite ones is the Sculptress mode, because this mode actually lets you create forms really quickly and easily. Right, you can see whenever I'm sculpting on a surface, it dynamically adds geometry to these surfaces. And by doing so, I'm able to quickly drag out forms. I can inflate, and while I'm doing all this, you can see that it's tessellating the details. It's giving me more resolution to work with. So this is what I've been using a lot lately. It lets me create forms really quickly. If I don't like something, I can smooth it out like that, and I can keep sculpting from there. So there are a few things to take note with the Sculptress mode, and that is the subdivide size and the undivide ratio. Now what I normally do is I set the undivide ratio to 1. This way, when I'm smoothing out, I'm actually smoothing out at the same resolution as the subdivide size. I definitely recommend playing around with these values. It's always different for the use case, but so far this is what I like to work with. So with Sculptress mode on, I'm able to use the snake hook brush, pull out forms really quickly. I can use the Damien standard. I can start creasing out forms like that. And that's pretty much how I create my primary forms during this stage of the process. I want to keep things loose and be able to make changes along the way. So let's take a look at the model for Monolith. And I have two versions over here. This is the final geometry. You can see a lot of effort went into creating these shapes. And I'll just give you all a quick demo on how I worked on creating these forms. So as I was saying, I'm usually working in Sculptress mode, and I'm not really too concerned with the actual underlying topology at this stage, right? If I feel like I want to extend certain areas, I just go ahead, and pull forms out like that. Likewise, if I feel like I want to remove certain areas, I can just simply smooth it out. You can see it's reassigning the topology. I can smooth out areas really quickly. I can use my flatten brush. I can just like chop off areas like that. And you can see I'm very quickly able to reshape these areas. And that's the beauty of Sculptress mode, right? Because it allows you to sculpt freely and not be too concerned with the topology. Now the only caveat for this is at some point you're going to have to transition away from this type of topology to something with quads, because quads are going to let you add the fine detail like you see over here. So what I'm going to show you next is when is a good time to transition over to a quad based topology. So just to reiterate, when I'm working on primary forms, I'm always working in Sculptress mode. You'll see my topology is kind of a mess, but it doesn't matter because I want to keep things loose, right? Once I'm happy with the primary forms, that's when I transition over to a subdivision workflow. So in order to transition from a Sculptress like topology mode over to something that's a bit more quad based like this, we have to use Z-remesher to create the level 1 subdivision level for our model, right? Because with proper subdivision levels, we are able to subdivide our model, and that's going to give us better topology to sculpt in the details. So what we would do, once you're happy with the primary forms of your model, I would use Z-remesher to create the level 1 subdivision levels. And you have to play around with the polygon count to see something that works for you. How I do this, I actually figure out like what's the maximum poly count I want, right? And then I just calculate backwards what that should be. So usually anywhere between 2 to 5 is a good point to start. You can subdivide that a few times. And right now I have 5 subdivision levels here. And that gives me about 2.16 million polygons to work with. So I could potentially subdivide it one more, and that would go up to around 8 million polygons. And it really depends on what you're sculpting, because it differs, right? If you're sculpting something that's relatively simple, then you don't need as much polygons to work with. So once you have your subdivision levels, that's when we can start using the other brushes to really sculpt in the details, right? This is going to give you the ability to transition between different subdivision levels. It's going to let you smooth in details a lot more easier, and generally it's just much more easier to work with compared to Sculptress mode. Let's dive a bit deeper into the brushes that I normally use. This is the model with our subdivision levels, so I'm going to start off by removing some of this detail over here, and that way I'm able to show you how I create this shapes. So my number one workhorse brush is definitely the clay buildup, right? I like it because it's easy to create forms really quickly, and I can smooth out. Now the trick with using the smooth brush with clay buildups, especially at higher subdivision levels, is oftentimes you find that your smooth brush isn't smoothing fast enough, or the effect isn't as strong. So what you can do is that you can adjust the weighted smooth mode to 1, and that's going to let you smooth a lot more stronger, especially at higher subdivision levels. So I'm going to add in some forms here. Again, not overly concerned with the surface texture, because I just want to carve in certain shapes. And then I might even use the Damien standard brush to add like a crease in there. Again, not overly concerned, because we're talking about secondary forms now, right? And then I would use the smooth brush with the weighted smooth mode to 1. You can see how fast that smooths out. So that's what I normally do with my primary and secondary shapes, using the clay buildup brush, Damien standard, and then the smooth brush a lot. Another brush that I like to use is the Form Soft brush. Now the cool thing about the Form Soft brush is it actually retains the overlying detail while affecting the underlying forms. So to give you a better example, you can see that there is a lot of textural detail over here. I'm going to use my Form Soft brush. I'm going to lightly go over it. You can see that I'm affecting the forms underneath, but I'm still retaining the detail on top. This is a very great way of adding forms when you already have details sculpted in. You can see that I'm still retaining all the detail over there. Let me find a better area to showcase that. So take for example all this detail here, right? I can use my form soft brush. I can go over it. And it's doing a pretty good job of retaining the detail. For Monolith, I also use the flatten brush a lot. You can see some of these flattened areas. What I did with those was I just used the trim dynamic brush and just add this really quick flattened areas. And sometimes I go back in again with my Damien standard brush. You know, if I wanted to accentuate some of these edges here, I can do so. Pablo Munez latest brushes to create details you see over here, like the pipes over here, as well as some of the cracks like that, and also some of this like skin sinew look over here. So I'll just show you all really quickly how I went about using those brushes. And again, I highly recommend those brushes. They are amazing. They were inspired by Beksinski and Geiger's work, so definitely check those out. So I'll start off by showing you how I created the sinews here. So for instance, if I wanted to create the sinew effect here, what I would do is I would mask out the area. So that I know that I'm not going to affect the arm and areas that are not suitable for this look. I can sharpen my masking a bit. I do that by holding Ctrl Alt. And then I can just simply select one of these brushes. I believe it was the membrane wall. Now I just want to make sure I'm at a right subdivision level where I have enough resolution to work with. So the cool thing about this method, it gives me a good base to work with. I can go in and start cleaning up some of this form using my smooth brush and using my form brush, and start to clarify what this shape over here looks like. You can see like it's a really good way to add details really fast. I would say with this method it's always important to understand that you don't always have to add detail everywhere. You have to be very careful where you add this type of detail because it can overwhelm the model. So with that look, that sinew look, I decided to add it over here in the crevices. You know, I made sure to not have that look happen on the bone area over here. So it's very intentional. You know, you don't want to overwhelm the model with detail, because that way your model will read well. You know, what you want to have is a nice balance between the clean areas and the detailed areas. Next, I'm going to show you how I created the pipe look over here. So let's pretend that we wanted that look here. So I'm just going to smooth out this area a bit. I'll do the same thing. You know, I can start masking out the areas where I want that pipe effect to go on. And there are many ways to do this, right? You can use the You can use just a typical mask pen brush, right? Or you can use the lasso. Let's use the lasso over here. I can use the lasso tool to subtract areas that I do not want. Then I can use Ctrl-Alt to sharpen my masking. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to quickly inset this area. I'm going to smooth it out. And then I'm going to use my masking tool again to sort of select this area over here. And then I'm going to use I believe it was the bone wall tool. Let's try this. Just want to make sure you have the right brush size for this to work well. So there you see I've managed to create that pipe look, you know, and of course you can go back in and clean things up a bit better so that it looks nicer. So that's pretty much how I created that look for areas over here, and even on the lower part of the model here. So with this, I did the same technique where I just used the mask lasso tool, and I just quickly selected an area out like that. You know, I would deform it downwards using my form soft brush, and then I would use that brush you saw just now and just go over it. Oops. Right, you see that's a very quick way to add details. Now the third brush I used from his brush set was the Qwek. I think it was believed some kind of Qwek brush. Yes, this organic cracks. And this was really fun to use because it was so easy to create that really dystopian surrealistic look. So I used that brush, you know, over here, you know, and areas like here. And again, the trick is to make it so that it looks random, right? Because if you keep using this brush everywhere, you know, it's going to be very obvious that you're using the same thing over and over again. So what I would do is I would use the brush, and then I'll go back in, use my flatten tool and smooth things out so that, you know, it looks a bit more unique. I might even go in and add my own cracks with the Damien standard. So just to run y'all through the other techniques I used to create Monolith, all the veins over here, those were done using the curved tube snap brush. So if you press B, C, I use the curved tube snap brush over here, and that lets you quickly create vines. And I'll just demonstrate really quickly. Like, you know, you just do that, and then once it's there, you can move it into place. And then you want to split those into a separate subtool. Right, so that was how I created this tube things over here. And for the head, it's pretty straightforward, you know, just standard techniques, you know, like I demonstrated earlier before, making sure you have good subdivision levels, so you can sculpt in details. For the vines over here, I did the same thing, use the curved tube snap brush. The only difference being I would merge the brushes together, and I can demonstrate really quickly how I did that. So let's say I wanted to create some vines over here. I would use the curved tube snap brush, right, and I add another one here, like that. And then you could smooth things out here. You can also use some features in the curve tube snap brush that lets you draw the brush but have it taper automatically. And then I would just try to drag this in there. And then what I would do next, I would just split this into a separate subtool, like that. You know, I'll use Dynamesh to join them really quickly. You know, I can keep sculpting if I want to. You can see they've been merged together. And then once I'm happy with it, you know, add some detail or whatnot, that's when I would use Z remesher to create some better topology. And then I could use my project all to reproject the details. So that's very quickly what I did to create the vines there. Now for the trees, I call them trees, but they're just spindly little things. It's the same thing again. I use curve tubes, you know, drag them out, and then I would use my Damien standard brush to create this crease effect over here. So I'm just gonna select those pieces really quickly to show you how I created it. So I would just do that and just very quickly add like subtle details on the trees. So that pretty much sums up the sculpting part for Monolith. Once I'm happy with the sculptural detail, that's when I move on to creating UVs. And for UVs, since we have our subdivision levels, it's pretty easy to use UV master. So over here I have this is my level 1 subdivision here. And what I would do is I would use poly groups to group out my UV shells, right? And then I would use UV master to quickly unwrap my UVs. Now the first time you use UV master, it's not going to give you this nice layout, right? It's going to be all over the place. Some shells are going to be offset and whatnot. The cool thing about ZBrush is you can move these UV shells anywhere you want. So I can begin to scale and move things around, right? I remember for this big part over here, I was able to relocate it to a different location. I can even selectively move this over here, make it smaller. And that's pretty cool because I can stay within ZBrush and do my UVs there. So once you have your UVs done, can show you all really quickly. Even for the trees, you know, I have my UVs. So you can see the UVs are pretty dirty. In this case, this was a static render, you know, it's not a game model, so I wasn't too concerned with wasting UV space. So ideally you want to optimize your UV space a bit better. But what I did for Monolith was I quickly used ZBrush to create all my UVs. It was really quick and easy. And then once I have my UVs done, that's when I move my model over to Substance, and I'll show you all really quickly what I did in Substance to create the textures. So for the textures for Monolith, I use Substance Painter. It's a texturing program for games and films. And what I've done is I've brought in my models, you know, created different texture sets. I have a texture set for the vines, a texture set for the head, a set for the main part over here. And I'm using a PBR workflow. My shader, I'm using a V-Ray metallic roughness shader. You know, this shader gives you a good representation of what the textures would look like when you render in V-Ray. I'm rendering in 3D Studio Max using V-Ray. And for the most part, my texturing workflow in Painter is essentially, I'll let this run for a bit. It's thinking. It's pretty heavy right now because I have all my textures showing up. Okay, there we go. I'm gonna turn off some of this here so that it doesn't slow down my machine. And for the most part, my texturing workflow in Painter is essentially just using the amazing resource that you have with Painter. You know, there are so many assets you can use here. And I would search for something like metal or like porcelain, you know, it would show me like really good things you can start off with, right? And then what I would do next is I would just layer the different materials to get the look that I want. So I'll run you through the materials for the main part over here. There's this snowy look on the top half, and then the bottom half is a bit of a metallic look. And there's this rust thing going on over here. And then lastly, for the pipes, there's a different like metallic look over there, again with some rust. So I'm just going to go through my layer stack, which is kind of a mess, but you know, when I work, it's usually very quick and dirty. I'm just like doing tests, you know, and I'm exporting my models over to 3D Studio Max. So one thing I did forget to mention, like while I'm texturing, I'm constantly exporting my textures into Max and then doing test renders with my lighting on, because that way I have a good idea of how my textures are going to look when they are rendered. So over here I have the pipe layer set. I'm going to turn it off really quickly. And in it is like a base plastic textures and adding like stuff like metal chips, you know, and then going in, and the key thing to take note over here is like the roughness and metal values, right? And sometimes I'm not overly concerned with like the details at this point when I'm starting texturing. My number one priority is making sure I get the roughness value right, so that, you know, the specular looks good and it has a nice contrast with the other areas. So I added a rust in there, you can see in the crevices. And a lot of times I'm using masking. I use like a mask editor, and usually I use something that has curvature in it, so that way I'm able to quickly add the rust in there. And then on top of the rust, I added an oil stain layer. And with this layer, again, you know, I have a pretty low roughness value so that it looks nice and wet. And then in the masking area, what I did was I used the dripping rust mask. And then I would go over it and paint out areas that I would want to clean up. So it's pretty much the same approach for the other parts. You know, Substance has so many great masking that you can use, grounded, oxidation, and I use a mix of different types of masking, you know, and then I'll go in and like adjust like how much contrast I want for the rust, or in this case the oil spreading, you know, how much oil I want. And then if I find like that certain areas is too much, I would just go in and like manually paint out the areas that I want to keep pretty clean, right? So for the top half, I used a one of the ice textures on the asset page. And the same approach. On the top half, I decided to keep it pretty clean. It's pretty much this Iceland snow windswept material. And then for the lovely rusted areas here, this was a lot of fun to do. I used the Matte Effects Rust Weathering. So I believe it's, if you search for Matte Effects, it's this one over here. And this texture gave me a lot of mileage, I have to say. It really helped bring the whole piece together. So I used a couple of different variations. You know, there was another one. There was this variation where it was a bit like big broad areas, and then I would add another layer with a bit of like, just add more variations and more of that drip look. I'm going to turn back my other texture sets. So one thing I do a lot in Substance is I'm like going through the different channels to make sure that I have a good idea of what the textures look like. So this is my base color, right? My roughness, you know, and this is a really good way of like analyzing what the contrast in those textures are going to be like, because that's going to affect the render a lot. You know, sometimes the actual material here, while that gives you a good representation of what the model is going to look like when you render in an external program, sometimes I find looking at the actual base color, roughness, metallic maps, you know, this gives me a clearer idea of what I'm getting out of my textures. Height map, normal map, and so on. So once you're happy with the textures in Substance Painter, that's when we have to export this textures over. And for this piece, I wanted to render a very high resolution final artwork. So I believe I did an 8K for the main part, which is the biggest part, and then for the head I believe I did like a 4K, and for the vines and you know, all these tube things over here, those are like 2K or 1K each. And then I would export all my texture maps and then start setting them up in 3D Studio Max. So what I do next is I'll bring my models into 3D Studio Max, and this is 3D Studio Max as you can see. One thing I forgot to mention, that I've actually decimated my mesh in ZBrush while keeping my UVs intact. So all the assets you see here that I've brought over from ZBrush, they are all decimated meshes. You just want to make sure that you keep your UVs intact when doing that. So the first thing I do after bringing those meshes in is I'll set up my materials. And before I do that, it's also important to mention that I am using an Asus workflow, and I'm using V-Ray to render. So under settings, under color management, I've set my color management to Asus CG, and then I've set up my materials. Pretty straightforward here, nothing out of the ordinary, to be honest. I have my albedo map, I have a normal map, I have a roughness map, and a metalness map. And again, I'm using a metallic roughness workflow, and then I'll just assign the materials to the models, and then after that I'll start setting up my lights. So for lighting, it's pretty straightforward. I have an HDRI here that's giving a bit of that ambient lighting to the scene over here, as you can see, and then I'll add a sunlight. And for this sunlight over here, I'm using all V-Ray lights, right? So let's turn that on. And you want to make sure that the radius is pretty big for sunlight. You can see before and after. And the trick to getting some nice soft shadows with the V-Ray light is to make sure that the radius is pretty big. And then I've added another fill light because I've noticed that the bottom half of the model over here is pretty dark. So I've added another fill light there and gave it a very small multiplier. So when I'm working on textures in Painter, what I would do is I would have this up running. You know, I will make my changes in Painter based on my light setup over here, and then that way I'm able to really fine-tune and get the results that I want. So the other great thing about V-Ray is with the latest frame buffer that they've released, there is a lot of control that you have over the final image. And over here I have my V-Ray frame buffer. And before you do this, you want to make sure that you have your render elements set up right. So over in your render setup, render elements, I have a ZDAP, a Cryptomatte, V-Ray back to beauty, and a denoiser. So I would render my image once at the resolution I want, and then I'm able to composite different elements over here. And this is a really powerful tool in V-Ray because it really lets you fine-tune and adjust each element on its own. So I'll run through some of the render elements here. And for the smoke, what I did was I bought a pack of VDB files, and what VDB files are, they are a volume format, volume database format, which essentially has data about volumetric effects such as smoke and clouds and things like that. So I'm able to quickly generate that smoke in the background. You know, I didn't have to set up particles in Max or anything. I literally just used a VDB file for that. So let's go through each layer. Over here we have the V-Ray background, we have the lighting, V-Ray GI, a reflection pass, we have specular, self-illumination, V-Ray atmosphere, which is the fog in the environment, and then above the back to beauty elements, you can add other elements so to control the exposure settings. So I have like separate exposure controls for the main part over here, for the head, you know, for the vines, and then I have a hue and saturation pass and a white balance pass. And above that composite group, this entire group here, that's the composite group. Above that I have my denoiser, and I have a lens effect, and lastly in hue and saturation. I have those turned off for now. So the great thing, as I've mentioned before, is that, you know, I can individually control the intensity of each of these elements. So for example, V-Ray lighting, right? I can control the multiplier. I can decide like how dark or how bright I want the scene to be. And the great thing about this, because I have added a Cryptomatte render element over here, I'm able to control that on a per element basis. So over here I have a matte for the trees. You know, I'm able to adjust, okay, I want the trees to be darker, I want it to be lighter, right? So I can do the same thing for GI. You know, I can raise the GI for the main part by twice as much. You know, I could lower it to be non-existent. So this is a really powerful feature in V-Ray, and it's so much fun to use. You can do things like adjusting the hue and saturation. You know, you can make things way more saturated or less saturated. You can't really tell, but if you look at the GI over here, you can increase the saturation, or you can desaturate it. It's really subtle, but you know, it's controls like this that really give you a lot of control. Let's look at the other elements we have in here. Specular, that's a good one. Okay, let me just fix my GI over here. So we have specular here, and this was great to just fine-tune how much specular I wanted on the metallic parts. Right, I can tone down the metalness on the body, or I could like increase it so that it's much more brighter. And then lastly we have the V-Ray atmosphere, and what this controls is the fog in the scene. So I could increase the fog, you know, make it look way more foggy. I can also use a hue and saturation to control the color of the fog, right? So if I wanted this fog to be green or purple, you know, I can have all of that control. So that pretty much sums it up in 3D Studio Max and V-Ray. And you know, this process over here gives you so much control on the final image. So what I did next was I also wanted to fine-tune the image a bit. There was some elements I wanted to add more realism to the final artwork. So I rendered several elements, and then I brought the elements over to Photoshop where I did my final comp in there. This is the final render that came out of V-Ray, and I brought it into Photoshop, and I've started adding some really minor adjustments. You know, I've done things where like I wanted like a light layer of fog above the ground plane over here, you know, and things like that is really easy to add in Photoshop versus actually creating that in 3D. And then I also added a bunch of color corrections. So over here, let's turn all this off, see what we get. Some curves adjustments, you know, over here I've added some light dust particles flying. Not sure if you can notice, like these tiny dots. You know, I believe that adds a bit more realism to the scene. Decided to tone back some of the cloud parts over here so that it's not such a hard contrast between the clouds and the sky. And then did like an overall curves adjustment, you know, a vibrance adjustment, and some really minor fixes. So just really tiny touch-ups in Photoshop, nothing too drastic. The great thing about V-Ray was that gave me a very good foundation to create the final image, right? And in instances where I feel like I needed, like let's say another pass with brighter GI, I would just go back into V-Ray, render a version with brighter GI, you know, bring it back into Photoshop, and then just mask out areas accordingly. So that brings us to the end of this demo, right? This is the final product. It's a really high resolution piece, you know, and I really wanted to challenge myself to see if I could create an iconic imagery with a new workflow. So I hope you've enjoyed this demo. You know, feel free to ask me any questions. You can go to my website at domqwek.com. You know, check out some of my works. I have tutorials up there. I have some products up there for sale as well. Thank you.